we don't seem to have quite copped on to the fact that we are at war with Russia yet. The sooner we do this, the better.
Is genocide occurring today in Ukraine?
It's our money and guns today or our daughters and sons tomorrow.
But how good and how strong is Europe when it comes to maintaining a healthy fact-based narrative? Are we losing that to Russia?
This is the greatest threat to our way of life that we have faced since 1945.
Hi, I'm Dominic Bowen, and welcome to the International Risk Podcast. And today we're joined by Cormac Smith. He's a former strategic communications advisor to Ukraine's foreign minister, and he was doing that between 2016 and 2018. He was actually the first foreigner embedded in the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he's helped Kyiv shape its message literally and politically and figuratively whilst under fire. And he's since advised the UK Cabinet Office on Russian disinformation and on hybrid warfare. He's also trained ministers and diplomats across Europe in strategic communication. And today, we're going to explore how Ukraine manages risk and resilience under what is really systemic stress, and what's changing in Russia's tactics today, and why strategic communication and authentic leadership is just as decisive as air defense systems are. Cormac, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Dominic, it's a great pleasure to join you. Thank you.
Cormac, last night was another terrible night in Ukraine, and Kyiv was hit along with several other cities, and electricity has been affected. Residential buildings were hit by Russian drones and missiles. But this isn't the first time. In the 1920s and 1930s, so 100 years ago, the USSR under Vladimir Lenin, he'd set up 900 concentration camps in Ukraine in an attempt to destroy the Ukrainian people, to remove the Ukrainian culture and the language and the heritage. Now, if we look at the legal definition of what genocide is, it's the physical destruction in whole or in part of a group of people. Is genocide occurring today in Ukraine?
Well, I absolutely believe it is, Dominic. I was predicting back in January of 2021 that Putin would go in, and if he did, it would be genocidal, because what I can remember saying at the time was he would have no compunction with murdering tens of thousands of innocent civilians. He had done it in Aleppo in Syria, and he had done it in Grozny in Chechnya. Unfortunately, that came to pass. The first city he decided to make an example of was Mariupol. Now, Mariupol was a city, beautiful city on the coast of 500,000, about the same size as Edinburgh in the United Kingdom. Mariupol has been virtually wiped off the map. 95% of the buildings destroyed. Nobody knows exactly what the death toll is. The most conservative estimate is that 25,000 civilians died in about 7 weeks of the siege of Mariupol. But reports from the mayor's office go up to as high as 100,000. Now, I know because a friend of mine, a chap called Sean Pinner, a former British soldier who emigrated to Ukraine and married a Ukrainian woman and took out Ukrainian citizenship. And when the war was on the horizon, he used his 19 years in the British Army experience and he joined the Ukrainian Marines. And Sean, got his wife out of the way and his family, and he stayed behind to fight for his home and his city. He was ultimately captured. They treated him as a terrorist or a mercenary. He was tortured horribly for about a year and a half. He was sentenced to death. He finally got out, thank God, on a prisoner swap. He has since written a great book called Live, Fight, Survive. I was having a meal and a few pints with Sean in London earlier on this year, and he told me where the title of the book came from. He got one last phone call to his wife before he was captured, and he was expecting her to break down crying, and she screamed down the line at him, live, fight, survive. Just to put it in context. So I know a little bit about Mariupol, apart from the band that I wear proudly on my wrist, which is a piece of the last steel ever produced in the Azov Steel and Iron Works in Mariupol, where that heroic last stand was carried out in defense of the city. These are sold now to raise funds for the Ukrainian armed forces. This was a 60th birthday present from my closest Ukrainian friend 2.5 years ago. I swore it would never come off until Ukraine has won this war, which In my heart, I believe they will, but we can talk more about that later. To put it in context, what they have done in Mariupol is the Nazis in Mariupol in 2 years in the Second World War killed 20,000. Russia has possibly killed 100,000 in 7 weeks. Put that in context. And it was systematic. And I don't want to go into the detail because I have pictures in my mind of the sort of atrocities and sexual violence that was perpetrated on not just Ukrainian women and men sometimes, but children and even babies by Russian soldiers in Mariupol, in Irpin, in Bucha, in other many other cities, towns, and villages where the Russians have entered, and this was systematic. So yes, this is, I believe, absolutely genocidal. You mentioned one of the tests. There are 5 tests in the United Nations Convention on Genocide. One of those is, and I can get the exact wording off the top of my head. Please don't challenge me on the exact wording of all 5, but it is taking children from the group and placing them with another group. Now, we know at the moment that this is the basis of the arrest warrant, which was issued nearly 2 years ago now for Putin and one of his director or his head of children's services or something. I can't remember her name, but that's been recognized, and we know that. Again, the most conservative estimates are 20,000, but actually, from a good source, I've heard a minimum of 35, possibly as many as 40,000 Ukrainian children have been stolen, kidnapped, put into a Russian family, spread far across the Russian Federation. And we also know that children who are of the right age are being forced into the armed forces to go and fight against their own people. This is genocide. We heard a lot of lies and a lot of disinformation as to why Putin invaded. And when I reeled them off, because I sat down with a good Ukrainian diplomat friend at the beginning, and I said, let's identify the top 5 lies that Russia tells to justify its invasion of Ukraine. Well, we've all heard it was NATO expansion. No, it wasn't. Ukraine wasn't even a member of NATO. We've all heard that Ukraine was full of Nazis. No, they're not. They had an election where 73% of the population voted a Jew of Russian heritage to be president, and Ukraine was the only country outside Israel that at one stage had a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister, who was Vladimir Groisman at one stage. They said that Donbass was a civil war. It wasn't. It was an internal feud that was fomented by Russia. That they said Maidan was a Russian-backed coup. Well, I have spoken to literally hundreds of people who stood on the Maidan for over 100 days. It was organic. There was no evidence that it's not a Russian-backed coup, an American-backed coup. Ukraine, at the time of the USSR, and always remember, the USSR was a Russian empire. Ukraine was the jewel in the crown. It accounted for up to 40% of industrial output and the wealth of the Soviet Union. But also, it's recognized that the Soviet army, the Russian army, is far, far less than the Soviet army was, and that's because they don't have the Ukrainians. And I think people can judge how effective the Ukrainians. I befriended a man who was a colonel in the Soviet army who fought in Afghanistan, who was also now a Ukrainian patriot, among the many people that I met and spoke to. So, Putin wants Ukraine back for the riches that it has, the breadbasket status, all of the rocket technology that sent Russia to the moon, that came mainly from Ukrainian scientists. Many of the athletes, as a young athlete, who were my heroes, that I thought were Russians, they weren't in latter years when I looked up. They were Ukrainians. I mean, so many. Like I used to be a javelin thrower. The guy who still holds the world record, Yuri Sedek. Oh, the Russian Yuri Sedek. Yuri Sedek wasn't Russian; he was Ukrainian. Anatoly Pisarenko, one of the greatest super heavyweight weightlifters ever to live. Oh, the Russian. No, he wasn't Russian. I found out many years later. He was from Kyiv. He was a Ukrainian from Kyiv. The list goes on and on. I mean, I could tell you this, but Putin wants Ukraine back for the riches and the human capital that it entails. The biggest threat to the survival of Putin and his kleptocratic mafia regime is the existence of a successful, thriving, free, democratic Ukraine on its doorstep. And that is why the Maidan revolution, otherwise known as the Euromaidan or the Revolution of Dignity, was the straw that broke the camel's back. We saw very soon after the Russians manufactured an excuse to go into Donbass in the east, and they illegally annexed Crimea. It's always important to remember this war did not start in 2022, February 24th. It started back in 2014. And I know men who've been fighting on the front line since 2014. I'm a very good friend of mine. Actually, the guy who gave me this bracelet said to me back in 2016 when I went out to Ukraine first, he said, Putin wants Ukraine without Ukrainians. I didn't quite believe or understand him. I understand him now. Another great Ukrainian friend said to me in the very, very early days of the further invasion, he said, Cormac, it's very, very simple. If Russia stops fighting, there will be no war. If Ukraine stops fighting, there will be no Ukraine. Putin wants to wipe Ukraine and every semblance of Ukrainian identity off the map, and he is willing to murder hundreds of thousands of people who would oppose him to achieve that. He has said this, and he is not even hiding in plain sight. He has told us. We need to listen to what he has told us. He has told us Ukraine is a fake country. We have been told another great Russian lie is that Ukraine was a invention of the Soviet Union. 1,000 years ago, Kyiv, when Moscow was a forest, Kyiv was one of the great world cities.
It's a very interesting history, and I do encourage anyone that is interested to have a look at the history of Ukraine and how Ukraine was actually the first country to have a printing press, to produce books, to produce Bibles, well before, over 100 years before Russia even started. We talk a lot about Russian culture and Russian history, but the Ukrainian culture is actually much deeper and much richer, and actually goes back much longer. But I also just want to emphasize the point you made, Cormac, about your friend and his book and what he and his family went through in Mariupol. I was in Mariupol just before the invasion, and I had dinner, and I remember going out for drinks one night, and people were out dancing and having a good night. And I remember saying to my Ukrainian colleagues, did people not realize what's about to happen here? And then, throughout the next couple of days, meeting with people literally on the street and in businesses and synagogues and churches. And I remember once in one of the main streets in Mariupol, and it's also important to remember the main street in Mariupol is no different to the main street in Oslo or Stockholm or Copenhagen. These are proper big cities. Don't think Eastern Europe, small villages. This is a proper big, beautiful city with waterfronts, beautiful restaurants and culture. But I remember actually drawing in a bit of dirt on the grass to an old lady. And I remember drawing a map of Ukraine and drawing the Donbass and drawing, Crimea and what was going to happen. I said, look, do you not accept that Mariupol would be such an amazingly rich target and a rich city that Putin would want to take? And she, like every person we spoke to, just went, no, it won't happen. It won't happen. And this is exactly what we see in Sweden, in Norway, in not in Finland, in Denmark. But people think it won't happen to us. That's exactly what happened in Ukraine, and it's what we've seen in so many other countries around the world. People say it's a them issue. That would never happen to us. There won't be war in our backyard. And I think it's a really important message that our listeners and business leaders and politicians need to hear. The Finns understand. The Finns take it really strongly, and the current leader of the Finnish government makes the message very clearly. And even some Swedish politicians have been saying, along with NATO leaders, business leaders need to be paying attention and they need to prepare for war, which in Sweden has really shocked society that politicians would use such vulgar language, but it's the reality. It's the reality today. And we know that Russia's war against Ukraine is also against Europe. And it's not just on the battlefield, it's in the minds, it's in our societies. And I'd love you to tell us, Cormac, how is disinformation shaping the reality that we think we're seeing, and how close is Europe? Because we know that whilst America innovates and China replicates, Europe is really big on legislating. That's our muscle. We can legislate. We can create lots and lots of laws. But how good and how strong is Europe when it comes to maintaining a healthy, fact-based narrative? Are we losing that to Russia?
Short answer, yes, and I'll come back and explain more about that in a moment. I just want to make two brief comments on what you've just said about Mariupol in particular. And the two comments are a good friend of mine. She's a Ukrainian refugee with her young daughter, and she's a journalist, very smart woman, and she has gone through several countries on the refugee trail, and ended up in the UK and got herself a good job where she can support herself and her daughter. But in her own time, then she does her journalism work and her activism work. What Elena told me recently was we were having a similar conversation to you and I, Dominic, and she told me, in the lead up to the war, people could not believe that this would happen because they had family members in Russia. They had seen themselves as brothers and sisters, and they were family members. They could not believe that Russia would do this. I've heard so many stories of people just breaking all family ties because what they got was they didn't get sympathy from family and friends in Russia. They got complete support for the invasion, complete support for Putin, and having completely swallowed the disinformation narrative, which of course Putin so easily pumps out, having absolute control over the Russian media as he does and as the Kremlin does. That's the first thing. So we're going on to disinformation. And I was talking earlier on about the five great lies that Russia tells, and I think I only got to four. There was not just discrimination, there was genocide against the Russian speaking minority. Ukraine, as you well know, because you've been out there, is a bilingual country. What I think started to happen more and more since 2014, people started to become a lot more aware and nationalistic and proud of their own language. But it was still, in Kyiv, you will frequently hear both languages spoken. Now, Mariupol, we talked about Mariupol. Mariupol was a Russian speaking city. My friend Sean Pinner, originally a Brit, the first language he learned wasn't Ukrainian, it was Russian. Not only was Mariupol a Russian speaking city, Mariupol was a city where the local politics was very, very pro Russian. And a lot of the local politicians were pro Russian. So Putin moved in. One of the reasons he was moving in was to protect the Russian speaking minority. And what did he do? He wiped a city of 500,000 people, a beautiful city, as you know, off the face of the map. And in doing that, murdered possibly 100,000 people. I was involved in a piece of research recently. We found that most people across the political spectrum in the UK, going from Labour, Lib Dem and Conservative supporters across to Reform supporters and Tommy Robinson supporters and people who lap up Russian disinformation. That was actually one of the groups that this research looked at. Most of them had forgotten about Mariupol. They'd forgotten about Bucha. They'd forgotten about Irpin. People have very short memories. But getting into your question now about disinformation, I've given you two examples of disinformation about the effect that it had on the Russian people and the great lie that he was going in to save the Russian speaking minority. So why did he pick a city that was a totally not only Russian speaking, but far more well disposed towards Russia than further west? And he wiped it off the face of the map and committed some of the most sickening atrocities against civilians. Images I can never get out of my head, and I never will be able to get out of my head because one doesn't think that humans are capable of such barbarism and such cruelty. This has been carried out. I've another good friend who is a senior Ukrainian diplomat in The Hague, so he's very, very close to all of the the war crimes investigations, and I frequently ask my friend, what's the latest number? How many war crimes are being investigated now? And it goes up, and every time I ask him, it goes up in tens. The last time was about a month ago. It was over 180,000 war crimes are being investigated by the Ukraine Prosecutor General with the aid of the international community. Yeah, as I said before, this is genocide that's happening. But on to disinformation. We are facing an enemy who last year, I was speaking to Ukraine's deputy ambassador to the UK about 3 weeks ago, and he told me that identified the Kremlin last year spent $1.4 billion on disinformation alone. That's not just with Russia Today, Sputnik, their troll farms, which were originally set up by Prigozhin in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but all of the other operations they do to sow narratives into Western society, to support elements on the far right and the far left, very often in the same country, because what they want to do is they want to sow division. They use something which in the British government we call a fire hose of falsehoods. So to give you an example, when they tried to murder Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in 2018. This was something I worked very closely on because I was in Kyiv when it happened, and my first thing was to speak to my ambassador, the British ambassador, who was my boss, and say, right, we need to get the Ukrainians on this. And first thing in the morning, I went into my minister and said, right, Ukraine needs to be one of the first countries to come out in support of the UK on this, because you keep telling me that Britain's your best friend. But we had an open source unit in the Foreign Office monitoring Russian disinformation, and they identified at the time 47 false narratives coming from the Kremlin as to who had tried to murder Skripal. It was Theresa May. It was the CIA. It was MI5. It was the mother-in-law. It blew in on the wind from Porton Down. The list went on and on. The lesson is, I come back, we call it the fire hose of falsehoods. The strategy of Russian disinformation is not to get us to believe any particular narrative. It's to give us so much rubbish that we don't know what to believe in. We're confused. It muddies the waters. I believe we're still not winning this, because I see every day, I see evidence in our societies of people who are still swallowing the Russian narratives. We have leading politicians who have very recently said it's the fault of NATO expansion that Russia invaded. It's not. When Finland, you mentioned earlier, joined NATO in 2023. Finland has a border of 1,340 kilometers with Russia. What's the first thing Russia did when Finland joined? Despite all the threats, they withdrew their troops from the Finnish border to redeploy them to Ukraine. I spoke to my friend in The Hague. He told me they had counted 120 times that Russia had rattled the nuclear saber. And unfortunately, every time they've done it, Western leaders have backed down. So, no, I don't believe we're winning the information war. And the reason is because we are facing a unified, focused, strategic machine campaign. They are not bothered by the difficulties of democracy. They can decide what they're going to do. We have very, very little in the way of government programs in any of our countries that are set up specifically to counter disinformation. During the Biden era, the department was set up in the United States to counter disinformation, and it was fairly soon closed down. And the accusation is that it was anti-free speech. And we see the sort of narratives that are pushed by the likes of Elon Musk, by the likes of the Vice President Vance of the United States, who comes over to Europe and lectures us on not having enough free speech and so forth. I think basically Russia uses our democracy against us. They are far more unified and strategic in their approach. What we lack as a coalition of 20, 30, maybe 40 nations, if we take the entire transatlantic alliance and other friends like New Zealand, Australia, Japan, South Korea. If we put all our friends together, we are disparate. We're not united, and the Russians are making hay with that. So no, we're not winning. We need to do a lot better. We need to be more united. We need to spend a bit more money on it and a bit more time.
So tell me how communications and information actually complement Europe's defense activities, and what does Europe and what does the West and what does Ukraine need to do differently right now to avoid even bigger problems?
I sit here in my comfortable, safe London home, and I am very reluctant to criticize anything Ukraine does, Ukrainian people do, or the Ukrainian government. However, let me start off by saying something I've been saying for over 3 years. There has never been a war in history where the information sphere is so important and so critical. And I think you and I would already suggest that we're not winning that war against the Kremlin. I think we need to find a way to be more united. I think we need to have much more of a focus on what we have come to call the coalition of the willing. We need to see Russia through Ukrainian eyes and through the eyes of the other people in what I always call the Eastern neighborhood. And those, I mean, the three small Baltic states, who are among the firmest allies of Ukraine, the Poles, and also Finland and Sweden. Finland and Sweden, by the way, joining NATO 2 years ago. That was not on Putin's plan. That's something that has made NATO far, far stronger. Finland, tiny little country, same population of Ireland, where I come from. Let's not talk about the thundering disgrace of Ireland's defence posture. Let's just not go there. But Finland, with a population of 5 million, can put almost 1 million men and women at arms in the field within 24 hours. They have more artillery pieces than Germany and France combined. And these people, I don't know if you've been to Finland, it's one of the most impressive countries I've ever been to, and Finns that I've known have been very impressive people. Russia tried messing with Finland in 1938 in the Winter War. It didn't go too well for them. We need to focus on you. I think you asked what we need to do. We need more unity of thought. We need more joined up thinking. And our leaders need to find a way to get there. And I've tried to do this in my own time as a communications advisor to Ukraine's foreign minister when I worked with colleagues across Europe in a group called the Friends of Ukraine. And I know how hard it is to get that unity. I could tell stories about that, but we'll be telling stories all day, so I won't. Our leaders need to decide to put more resources into it. And at a time when, certainly here in the UK, cost of living is a major, major problem, we need to do the unpopular act of spending even more on this. Is part of our defence spending. And at the moment, the truth is, if we spend more on defence, we're going to spend less on other services, or we're going to raise taxes, or we're going to do both. I hear all too often, it's not our war. It's a war far away. It's not going to come to us. I've been saying for 3.5 years, this wolf will come. This wolf is at our door. But secondly, you asked me about Ukraine. I'll be honest, I think Ukraine can do better in their government communications. I think they need to be more strategic. I think there needs to be possibly greater devolved leadership of the message. I am not going to say what I think Volodymyr Zelensky should do different, because for all his faults, which we all have, this man is probably the greatest war leader of the 21st century. Most of the Ukrainian government may have been relocated in the early days, which I believe it was. But we had that famous film in the middle of the night on the second night where Zelensky repeating that Ukrainian word, "Tut," here, we're all here. And this was when there was nightly attacks on his life by Russian special forces who were being parachuted into the city to hunt him down and kill him. Ukraine wasn't supposed to last more than 3 days. They have confounded the expectations of most Western leaders. So, yes, I'm sure the Ukrainians could do better, but look, they're fighting for their lives. I cannot bring myself to criticize anything that my friends in Ukraine are doing, or the Ukrainian people or the Ukrainian government are doing. My best Ukrainian friend, I woke up at 7 this morning and I immediately had a message from my closest Ukrainian friend, lives in Kyiv, and sent me about a dozen photographs of burning buildings and burnt out cars and bomb damage and everything else. This is Putin's will to break, or Putin's effort to break the will of the Ukrainian people. He's using precision munitions on a almost daily or a nightly basis to target civilians and civilian infrastructure to destroy and break the will of the Ukrainian people. Spoiler alert, he won't achieve it. What Ukraine does at the same time is to use their long-range strikes to attack elements of the logistics chain, significantly at the moment the oil industry, which is, having the West prevented them from using the long-range weapons that we gave them for too long. What do the Ukrainians do? We'll do it ourselves. They have now developed a cruise missile, the Flamingo, with a range 10 times of anything we have given them. 3,000 kilometers, and its warhead is over twice. Scalp and Storm Shadow. Storm Shadow, which the Brits were the first to give them long-range munitions, but the Americans, under Joe Biden, stopped them using it at elements of the logistics chain, not just elements of the logistics chain, bomber bases, where the bombing raids on Ukrainian civilians were being launched night after night after night. And Joe Biden said, no, you can't use weapons that have our guidance systems in them, because we think that we might poke the bear and it might be escalatory. It has been supine cowardice on behalf of our leaders for 3.5 years, and on behalf of the Americans in particular, and the Germans and others. Yes, we seem to be changing late in the day. Remember Friedrich Merz this time last year, when he was campaigning to be chancellor, said if he got the position of chancellor, he would give Putin 24 hours to cease hostilities or he would flood Ukraine with tourists. I was in the office of Ukraine's ambassador to Berlin 2 years ago, and on his mood board in the middle of it was written Taurus. Ukraine still has not been given Taurus by the Germans. Olaf Scholz, that great military tactician, said last year that he didn't believe that Ukraine needed Taurus. So, I'm afraid we are changing, but we're changing too slow. And if you empathize, as I think you do as well, with the people who are really suffering on this, it's infuriating.
It definitely is, Cormac. And you mentioned that the wolf is at the gates, and I think I might push back on you a little bit. Working with companies across Europe, I'd say that wolf is well and truly running around our back and our front yard. And I think over the last few years, we've definitely seen a surge in hybrid operations across Europe. We've seen sabotage in Denmark, in Sweden, in Norway. We've seen GPS jamming affecting aircraft over the Baltics. We've seen Russian drone and aircraft incursions over Poland and Romania. We've seen Russian led disruptions to maritime infrastructure in the Baltics and in the North Sea. Now, none of these alone are headlines on the front cover of the paper, but together they form a really, really clear pattern. And it's undoubtedly a persistent campaign which is designed to erode confidence, to blur attribution, and really to test what NATO's thresholds are. And as you said, NATO's thresholds are blurred, they're slow, they're really not strong enough. So, Cormac, you've spent years inside the British government and supporting the Ukrainian government and helping leaders navigate the grey zone between all out peace and all out war. And this is where truth, perception, and deterrence all come together. So, when states like Poland, Romania, Denmark, Sweden, Norway face these constant breaches, cable cuts, GPS interference, drone overflights, how should these governments be responding without overreacting, but at the same time without normalizing and inviting further aggression?
Well, I don't think there's any question of overreacting or inviting further aggression, with all due respect. And I know it's not your words, but they're the words and the tone of the appeaser. And always remember what that great Briton Winston Churchill said about appeasers. He said the appeaser was the one who fed a crocodile hoping he would be eaten last. We've already seen incursions into NATO airspace several times. We've now heard some very, very strong words that we may actually move to shoot them down next time. We await to see this. Putin is constantly probing to see how far he'll get. That's what bullies do. But it's not just in Eastern Europe. I spoke to a good friend of mine who's a former colonel in British military intelligence. We do some work together on this very issue. And I spoke to him before I came on this. And he said, what we're seeing in the UK at the moment is a tactic by Russia where they seem to be hiring local criminals. So we're having arson attacks. We had cyber attacks on Marks and Spencers, on John Lewis Partnership, on other high street names. They haven't been unequivocally linked or proven to be Russia yet, but we know this is in the Kremlin's playbook. We know that, and I've been told this on good source, we know that their hybrid attacks on us are absolutely incessant, and they are constantly probing to see what they can get away with on the one hand. Two, they are looking to cause us as much expense and disruption and difficulty as they possibly can. Almost 8 years ago this month, I was out in Halifax in Canada at a major security conference with Pavlo Klimkin when he was Ukraine's foreign minister. And there was a press conference where people were talking about, is this a new Cold War? Pavlo told basically anybody who was listening, the journalists in the world, that no, we're not in a new Cold War. We are in a hot war. It's just a slightly different type of war. It's hybrid war. It's only in the last year or so that we hear what I call some bigger people talking about this, former heads of the security services, colonels, some, former senior diplomats talking about, it seems to be, we talk about grey zone warfare. Grey zone warfare, hybrid warfare are the same things. That extended to the assassination attempts on the Skripals. It is many, many very questionable cases of arson, which we are seeing up and down the UK and other countries at the moment. It's cyber attacks. It is all sorts of attacks on our infrastructure, our security services, including GCHQ, MI5, MI6. They're doing everything they can to keep us safe. But I've been told that it is absolutely incessant and rising. Russia knows they're at war with us. We don't seem to have quite copped on to the fact that we are at war with Russia yet. The sooner we do this, the better. You know, you said I was a professional communicator. Well, I was for most of my life, and I love my sound bites. Because I think if you get a good soundbite, people remember it. But then you've got to go in, unlike some of our leaders, and you've got to put real meat on the bones, and you've got to give the data and the facts and the proof points. Well, one of my soundbites that I've been deploying for nearly a year now is, it's our money and guns today or our daughters and sons tomorrow. It's still not too late. And I go back to 2021 when Alexei Reznikov, who was the last Minister of Defense of Ukraine, went on CNN a few days before Christmas. And I can still remember him saying, we don't want or expect your boots on the ground. Just give us the weapons we want and we will do our own fighting. And I thought, arm Ukraine to the teeth and sanction Russia back to the Stone Age. Well, we still have not armed Ukraine to the teeth properly. And we still have not sanctioned Russia back to the Stone Age properly. And I believe, and from an industrial point of view, Dominic, you will have an even clearer picture of how much damage is currently being done to the Russian economy by the combination of sanctions, but more importantly, what Ukraine is now doing to their oil industry. Because remember, Russia has been described as a petrol station with nukes. They have very, very little else. The Ukrainians have now pushed them to a point where they're having to import petrol. This is doing two things. This is bringing the war home to the Russian people. It's holding their feet to the fire. And I've said many times, the thing that Putin fears most is the Russian people. Every czar in history, if they have fallen, they have always fallen to the Russian people. It is also seriously interfering with their ability to feed their front line, to get troops around, to get supplies, to get ammunitions and everything to their front line. Good friend of mine, I don't know if I've mentioned it in this conversation already, Sean Pinner, he fought in the defense of Mariupol in the Ukrainian Marines. And Sean said to me only a few days ago, he said, Ukraine will help Ukraine. They know they're on their own. They will be very polite and they will thank President Trump and everybody else for everything that they do. But in their hearts, when you really get close to the Ukrainians, as I am with many, and you have an honest conversation, they know they're on their own and they're bitter about it. And they know they're in an existential fight for their life. Now, you know, I've got to say, as a proud Irishman, that I am immensely proud of what Britain has done from the start. You know, we have been the first ones. We have led on this from the start, and that leadership seems to have carried on through the change of government last summer into Keir Starmer's government. Britain are seen as Ukraine's best friend. I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud to have played a small professional part in it. And I now, obviously, as a private individual, I do what I can because it matters. I fell in love with the country. I made friends for life. But also, I see that this is the greatest threat to our way of life that we have faced since 1945. This is the point that's so hard to get across to people. And this is why I was so interested to come on today and speak to you, Dominic, because you specialize in the area that I probably know least about, which is the industrial sector, the private sector. And you're telling me, actually, people in industry are really waking up to this. And they really realize the existential threat it is to us, because let's face it, if we don't have thriving, successful industry, bang goes our standard of living. Yeah, we won't have a standard of living if we don't make sure Ukraine wins this war before we have to actually start fighting ourselves. And that will come if we're not careful. Got to realize that this is a major threat. Putin will not stop at Ukraine in his desire to put the Russian Empire back together. Part of this is arrogance on behalf of the West, and the attitude was, this is how we do things in London, Rome, Paris, Washington, D.C., and if you do it like this here, then you'll get better. And it's not like that, because I found out before I ever went out, but I found out that you're dealing with the most sophisticated, highly educated, decent, warm, but also hard as nails people who have faced things in the last 80 years that we have no idea about. We don't know we're born. As I said earlier, we need to see Russia and the wider world through Ukrainian eyes and through the eyes of their other friends in the eastern neighborhood. And we need to be a little bit more humble. We need to drop the hubris, and we need to drop the arrogance. I still see far too much of it.
Yeah, thanks for raising that, Cormac. And one of the things that I do when helping organizations and business leaders across Europe do when looking at crisis preparedness is I'll talk about the 5 phases of war. That's from all out peace to all out conflict, and of course, the phases in between. And before Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, when I talk to business leaders and executive groups about where do they assess we're at, based on the 5 phases of war, normally they'd put up 1 finger, 2 fingers. After Russia's invasion in 2022 of Ukraine, business leaders and executives started talking about, oh, we're probably in phase 2, maybe phase 3. Now, when I run these workshops in mid and late 2025, people are consistently putting up 3 and 4 fingers, which is really, really interesting, that business leaders recognize that on the 5 phases of war, we're probably in phase 3 or phase 4 now, which is really different to where Europe was just a few years ago. But thanks very much for coming on the podcast today, Cormac. I think that was really insightful. We appreciate your passion. We appreciate your interest and your insights. So thanks very much for coming on and talking about the war in Ukraine, as well as the implication for all European nations. Now, please, to our listeners, you can find our content on YouTube. Please remember to subscribe. That's critical for our success. Thanks very much for listening today, and we'll speak again in the next few days.